Do not settle for being the same man or woman who awoke this morning. Dare to die to that version of yourself, and in your imagination, be reborn into the one you desire to be. For the secret of transformation is not found in effort, but in assumption. Beloved, the world mirrors only what you accept within. If you persist in gazing at the reflection of the old self, you will live as that shadow. But if you focus so intently upon the image of your ideal, so deeply that the old self fades, you will awaken unrecognizable even to yourself. Imagination is the workshop of creation. When you clothe yourself inwardly in the feeling of already being the one you wish to be, you breathe life into a new reality. Persist, not in fleeting wishes, but in dwelling with unwavering focus on the end accomplished. For what you dare to assume in the silence of your mind must harden into fact. Do not be discouraged by appearances. Appearances are but echoes of yesterday's beliefs. Look not there for proof, but within. Hold your focus. Nurture the seed of your new self. As you water it with belief and guard it with persistence, it will grow until the harvest is undeniable. So I say to you, focus so hard, so faithfully, that the old you dissolves. Let your new self so fully possess you, that when others behold you, they scarcely recognize who you are, for you have stepped into a higher vision of yourself. Awaken now, imagine boldly, assume faithfully, persist until transformation is complete, and you shall stand unrecognizable, for you have become what once was only a dream. Transformation begins in imagination, for it is within the unseen chamber of the mind that the seed of every change is planted. Before a body can be reshaped, a career elevated, or a life renewed, it must first be conceived as real within the silent theater of thought. The imagination is not fantasy, but the creative power that calls the unseen into the seen. To imagine is to give form to the invisible, to clothe an idea in substance, and to prepare the soil for its manifestation. Every great shift begins as a vision held steadfast within consciousness. The world mirrors your inner assumptions, reflecting back to you, not what you wish in passing, but what you persistently believe to be true. Every encounter, every circumstance, every so-called chance event is but the outer expression of an inner conviction. If you assume lack, the world will present lack. If you assume rejection, the faces you meet will echo rejection. Yet, if you dare to assume abundance, love, or success, you will find doors opening, people responding, and conditions aligning to match that assumption. The law is impartial. It does not judge between good or bad, worthy or unworthy. It simply reflects. Just as a mirror cannot show you a face other than the one you present, life cannot reveal to you anything beyond the state you occupy within. To change the reflection, you must change the image you hold of yourself. This is why imagination is sacred, for it is the place where assumptions are crafted and identities are chosen. You do not wait for the world to change so you may believe differently. You believe differently, and the world must rearrange itself accordingly, for it is compelled to display the likeness of the assumptions you faithfully sustain. Focus so deeply on the new self that the old dissolves, for the mind cannot serve two masters. When you occupy the state of the old self, its memories, its failures, its limitations, you bind yourself to its repetition. But when you dare to dwell entirely in the reality of the new self, you starve the old of life. The past survives only through your attention, and attention is the food of reality. Withdraw it, and the old self withers. Bestow it upon the new, and it flourishes. This is the secret of transformation. Not a battle with what was, but an undivided focus upon what is becoming. To focus deeply is not to strain, but to surrender. It is to immerse yourself so completely in the feeling of already being the new self that you forget the habits of the former one. You speak as the new self, you think as the new self, you walk, act, and imagine as though no other version of you has ever existed. The mind, impressed by repetition and feeling, accepts this state as fact, and what is impressed must eventually be expressed. The old dissolves not because you fight it, but because you no longer feed it with belief. Persistence is the bridge. The world may, for a time, echo the remnants of your former state, but remain unmoved. Fix your attention again and again on the new image, the higher vision of yourself. As the sculptor chips away all that does not belong, you, through sustained focus, dissolve every trace of the old identity. Soon the line between imagining and living disappears, and you awaken fully in the new self, with no memory of struggle, for the old has vanished into nothingness, while the new stands undeniable. Assumption, not effort, brings change. For life responds not to the force of your hands, but to the quiet conviction of your heart. Many exhaust themselves in striving, pushing, and struggling against circumstances, believing that sheer willpower alone will bend the world in their favor. Yet the world is not moved by toil, but by belief, not by frantic activity, but by the state you occupy within. To assume is to step into the end already accomplished, to claim in consciousness what the senses may still deny, and to rest in the certainty that what is real inwardly must become real outwardly. Effort belongs to the realm of resistance, to the belief that something is missing and must be attained. Assumption belongs to the realm of fulfillment, where you live in the awareness that it is already done. When you assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, you bypass struggle entirely, for struggle implies separation, while assumption proclaims unity. In assumption, you cease from striving, and by resting in the end, you call it forth. This is why imagination holds greater power than action alone. For imagination clothes the invisible with reality, and once assumed, the outer world is compelled to conform. To live by assumption is not to neglect action, but to transform it. Action taken from assumption flows naturally, effortlessly, without the burden of doubt. It is no longer the desperate attempt to force an outcome, but the joyful expression of one who already possesses the outcome within. The difference is subtle, but absolute. Effort looks forward, hoping to achieve. Assumption looks inward, knowing it already is. One is restless, the other serene. One scatters energy, the other gathers it into form. This is why those who act without assumption labor endlessly, while those who assume and then act move with a quiet authority that bends reality. Assumption requires persistence, for the senses will tempt you to believe in lack and delay. But the moment you return again and again to the state of fulfillment, you impress it deeper upon the subconscious, and the subconscious, being the womb of creation, must bring it forth. Nothing resists a sustained assumption, for assumption writes the script that life must perform. To assume is to choose, to claim, and to live from the end, and in doing so, you discover that true change is never forced. It is accepted. Appearances are echoes of past beliefs, for what you see today is not the harvest of this present moment, but the residue of thoughts and assumptions once entertained. The world of form moves with a certain rhythm, a lag between the planting of belief and the flowering of experience. When you gaze upon your circumstances, you are not beholding truth, but a reflection of who you once accepted yourself to be. To judge your life by appearances is to live as a prisoner of yesterday, forever bound by the shadows of beliefs that have already run their course. Every condition, no matter how fixed it seems, is but a mirror of inner acceptance. Poverty is not a decree of fate, but the echo of having assumed lack. Loneliness is not destiny, but the echo of having assumed separation. Failure is not a permanent state, but the echo of having assumed limitation. These appearances remain as long as attention feeds them, for attention sustains belief, and belief sustains form. But the moment you withdraw belief from what is seen and place it upon what is desired, you begin to break the chain of repetition. Appearances may linger for a time, but their power weakens as the new state gains strength within. To understand appearances as echoes is to take dominion over them. An echo may be loud, but it carries no life of its own. It is only the residue of a voice already spoken. Likewise, appearances shout loudly at times, declaring the permanence of lack or struggle, yet they hold no creative power in themselves. The power belongs to the belief that once gave them birth. When that belief is dissolved and replaced by a higher assumption, the echo fades until silence is reached, and then a new sound, a new appearance, takes its place. This is the rhythm of manifestation. Belief impresses, time echoes, reality conforms. Do not look outward for validation, for the outward is always a step behind the inward. To demand proof before belief is to reverse the law, for belief is the cause, and proof is the effect. The wise man sees beyond appearances, holding steadfast to the inner conviction, even while the outer world lags in recognition. Just as the farmer does not dig up the seed to check its progress, so you must not abandon faith because appearances seem unchanged. Appearances are the past playing itself out, while the future waits in the unseen, already secured by assumption. When you grasp this, patience ceases to be suffering and becomes trust, for you know the echo cannot outlast the voice that spoke it. Thus appearances are never the measure of possibility, but only the evidence of what was once believed. When you recognize them as such, you cease to fear them. You no longer bow to their threats or accept their verdicts. Instead, you turn within, choose anew, and persist in the unseen vision, knowing that appearances, like echoes, must eventually fade. Yielding to the resonance of the belief, you now dare to hold persist in the feeling of the wish fulfilled, for persistence is the golden thread that binds imagination to manifestation. A single thought, fleeting and unguarded, carries little weight, but a sustained assumption, impressed upon the mind again and again, becomes law to the subconscious. To persist is to remain unmoved by appearances, to choose the unseen over the seen, to hold steadfastly to the inner reality, even when the outer world denies it. It is not a struggle, not a constant battle, but a gentle returning, a quiet but resolute decision to dwell in the state of the wish already accomplished. The feeling of the wish fulfilled is the secret place where creation is completed. It is the inner act of assuming the end, of living inwardly, as though what you desire is already here. This is not mere daydreaming, for daydreaming looks forward in hope, while assumption lives in the present in certainty. When you persist in this feeling, you impress it deeper upon the subconscious mind, and the subconscious, being the womb of creation, must bring forth what is planted within it. Just as soil cannot resist the seed entrusted to it, life cannot resist the sustained conviction of one who refuses to leave the state of fulfillment. To persist does not mean to strain, but to return. The mind may wander, doubts may arise, appearances may contradict, yet persistence is the art of bringing yourself back again and again to the inner reality of the wish fulfilled. Each return strengthens the impression, each return weakens the hold of the old state. In time, the new state becomes natural, effortless, and self-sustaining, while the former state dissolves from lack of attention. Persistence is faith in action, for faith is not a passive hope, but an active dwelling in the unseen reality until it becomes undeniable. Consider the man who plants a seed in the ground. He does not demand that it bear fruit overnight, nor does he abandon it when the field remains barren for a season. He waters it, he protects it, he trusts the process. So it is with persistence in imagination. You may not see immediate results, for appearances are delayed reflections, but the unseen work is already accomplished the moment you accept it within. To persist is to refuse to uproot the seed of belief with doubt and impatience, but to nourish it continually with the feeling of completion. Persistence requires discipline of attention. The world will attempt to claim your focus, to lure you into fear, lack, or delay, but you must guard the inner sanctuary of assumption. Whenever the mind strays, gently but firmly guide it back to the state of fulfillment. Imagine the scene that implies your wish is realized. Feel the relief, the joy, the gratitude of having it already. Rest in that feeling as often as possible, until it becomes the natural atmosphere of your mind. In this way, persistence is not burdensome but liberating, for it frees you from the tyranny of appearances and anchors you in the certainty of fulfillment. Persist long enough, and the line between imagination and reality dissolves. The outer world, once resistant, begins to mirror the inner conviction. People, circumstances, and events shift to align with the assumption you have sustained. The wish fulfilled, once only a vision in consciousness, now stands embodied in form, undeniable and complete. Yet by the time it arrives, it feels natural, inevitable, for you have lived with it inwardly until it became your identity. This is the quiet power of persistence. It does not conquer through force, but through unwavering focus, through the continual choice to remain in the state of the fulfilled desire, until it is the only reality you know. Nurture your new self with faith and focus. For like a tender seed planted in fertile soil, the vision of who you wish to be requires care, attention, and persistence before it blossoms into visible form. Faith is the water, Focus is the sunlight, and together they sustain the growth of the unseen until it becomes the seen. The new self, once conceived in imagination, is fragile in its beginnings, for the old self will attempt to reassert itself through habit, memory, and appearances. Yet if you nurture the new identity with unwavering faith and steady focus, it strengthens day by day until the old dissolves completely and the new stands in its place as natural and undeniable. To nurture is to guard. The new self must be protected from the intrusions of doubt, fear, and contradiction, for these are the weeds that choke its growth. Faith is the shield that guards against these intrusions, the inner knowing that what is accepted within must one day be expressed without. Faith does not demand proof, nor does it bend to appearances, for faith looks beyond what the senses declare and rests in the conviction that the unseen is already accomplished. When faith is coupled with focus, the new self receives nourishment continuously, for focus directs your attention again and again to the vision of the fulfilled desire, preventing the energy of your mind from scattering into states that no longer serve you. Focus is the discipline of attention. To focus on the new self is to dwell in its reality, to think its thoughts, to feel its feelings, to imagine its victories, until it becomes more familiar to you than the limitations of the old self. This is not a matter of force, but of persistence. The mind may wander, appearances may contradict, but each time you return to the state of the new self, you strengthen its roots. With repetition, the identity once imagined becomes natural, effortless, and self-sustaining. What was once a conscious act of focus becomes an unconscious habit of being. This is the alchemy of nurture. The deliberate becomes automatic, the imagined becomes embodied, the desired becomes lived. Faith carries you when appearances tempt you to despair. For appearances are nothing but the echoes of past beliefs, and if you allow them to dictate your state, you will return again to the old identity. To nurture the new self is to remember that appearances lag behind inner conviction, that the harvest always comes after the seed is planted. Faith whispers that the work is already done, that what you have assumed in imagination exists now in the unseen, and persistence ensures it must one day be revealed. With such faith, you cease to uproot your desire with doubt, and instead allow it to unfold in perfect order. The nurturing of the new self also requires gentleness. Just as a gardener does not rage at the soil or demand the seed to grow overnight, you must not turn impatience or frustration upon yourself. Every return to the new self, no matter how many times you have strayed, is progress. Each act of focus strengthens the impression. Each act of faith deepens the conviction. Even when the old identity rises with force, its power diminishes with every moment you choose the new. In time, the balance shifts, and what once felt unnatural and distant becomes the very atmosphere of your life. To nurture the new self is to live in harmony with the law of assumption, to recognize that you are always becoming what you accept yourself to be. Faith ensures that you trust the unseen process, and focus ensures that your attention remains aligned with the desired outcome. Together, they form the foundation of transformation. When the mind is disciplined by focus and the heart is anchored in faith, the new self cannot fail to emerge. It grows quietly but powerfully until it fills your consciousness so completely that the old self vanishes without trace, leaving only the reality of the one you chose to become. Ignore temporary contradictions in the outer world, for they are but the fading remnants of the old state, powerless except by the attention you grant them. Every change you desire to experience begins first in the unseen, within imagination, through the assumption of a new state of being. The outer world, being only a mirror, cannot instantly discard the reflections of your past beliefs. Just as the echo lingers after the voice is spoken, so too do circumstances linger after a state has been abandoned. To dwell upon these contradictions is to breathe life back into the old identity, but to ignore them is to starve them, allowing the new assumption to take root and flourish. The wise understand that appearances do not carry creative power. They are not causes, but effects. They are shadows, outcomes, footprints of states once entertained. When you judge by appearances, you deceive yourself, for you are measuring tomorrow's potential by yesterday's harvest. To ignore temporary contradictions is to see with the eyes of faith rather than the eyes of the flesh. It is to remind yourself that what is real is not always visible, that the invisible world of imagination is the true cause of all that will unfold. The contradictions are only the outer world's slow adjustment to your inner transformation. They are not obstacles but evidence that change is already in motion, that the old is dissolving and the new is being born. To ignore is not to resist, nor to pretend that contradictions do not exist. Resistance feeds them. Denial strengthens them, but indifference dissolves them. You simply refuse to give them authority. You acknowledge their presence, as you might acknowledge passing clouds, but you do not surrender your vision to them. You turn inward, again and again, to the feeling of the wish fulfilled. This steadfast return is your true work, for the inner assumption is the seed, and the outer contradiction is merely the field before harvest. If you remain faithful to the inner state, the field must eventually bear fruit in harmony with what you have assumed. Faith is the power that makes ignoring contradictions possible. Without faith, the senses dominate and you become enslaved to what is. With faith, you recognize that appearances are delayed reflections, and that they cannot withstand the persistent assumption of a new identity. Faith whispers that the unseen is more real than the seen, that the contradiction is temporary, while the assumption is eternal. With such faith, you can walk calmly through storms of contradiction without being moved, for you know they are nothing but signs that the old self is breathing its last breath. Focus is the companion of faith, for focus directs your attention to what is true within, while ignoring what is false without. Every moment you dwell in the inner vision of fulfillment, you feed the new state and weaken the grip of the old. When you catch yourself swayed by contradictions, gently return to the inner image. Feel it real, see it done. Embody the state of already being. In this way, you are not fighting appearances, but transcending them. You are no longer their prisoner, for you have chosen to live by imagination, rather than by sight. The contradictions, though uncomfortable, serve as teachers. They reveal how deeply rooted the old assumptions once were. Their persistence is not proof of failure, but evidence of transition. Just as the night does not vanish the moment the sun rises, but gradually yields to the growing light, so too do appearances yield to a sustained assumption. If you persist, the contradictions will fade, not by force, but by inevitability. The outer world has no choice but to conform to the state you occupy within, for it has no life independent of consciousness. To ignore temporary contradictions is to practice patience without passivity. You do not wait idly for change, but actively dwell in the end you have chosen. You do not allow appearances to dictate your mood, your faith, or your persistence. You live from the unseen cause, not the visible effect. In doing so, you align yourself with the rhythm of creation, which always begins in silence, in invisibility, before it breaks forth into form. Every contradiction you ignore strengthens your mastery, for it proves that you no longer need the approval of the senses to validate the unseen reality you have claimed. When the new state becomes dominant in your consciousness, the contradictions dissolve naturally, like mist before the sun. The world begins to reflect the new assumption with perfect fidelity. People respond differently. Circumstances shift, opportunities emerge, and what once seemed impossible unfolds as the most natural thing in the world. By then, the contradictions are forgotten, for they were never the truth. They were only the fading shadows of an identity you no longer occupy. The true power was always within, and by ignoring temporary contradictions, you allowed that power to express itself. Without interference, transformation is complete, when even you no longer recognize the old self. For true change is not a surface adjustment, but a profound shift in identity so complete that the former version of you becomes like a distant memory belonging to someone else. The old self, with its habits, its fears, its limitations, its beliefs, once seemed so real, so permanent, yet when transformation has done its work, you look back and find it difficult to imagine how you ever thought, spoke, or acted in that way. The chains of memory that once defined you are dissolved, and in their place stands a new being, radiant with the strength of imagination and assumption. This is the essence of Neville Goddard's teaching, that man can die to one state and live to another, and that this death and resurrection are not symbolic alone. but literal in the experience of consciousness. The old self clings for a time, attempting to reassert itself through appearances, through habit, through echoes of past beliefs. But as you persist in nurturing the vision of the new self, as you clothe yourself more fully in its feeling, the grip of the former identity weakens. You cease to respond as you once did, cease to think as you once thought, cease to expect what you once accepted as inevitable. Each moment of living from the new self is a step further from the old until eventually the distance becomes immeasurable. What once defined you no longer belongs to you, for you have moved to a higher plane of being, and in that elevation, the former you cannot survive. Transformation does not come through effortful striving, but through the assumption of already being. When you dare to assume the state of the new self and persist in that assumption, the subconscious mind receives the impression and begins to reorganize your world to match it. At first, you may still see traces of the old self in your circumstances, for appearances echo past beliefs, yet as you remain faithful to the new state, these echoes fade. The outer world bends to the new inner conviction, and gradually the evidence around you shifts until it reflects only the identity you have claimed within. Transformation is therefore not a single act, but a process of persistence, faith, and focus, culminating in the complete disappearance of the former identity. When transformation is complete, you no longer try to remember to be the new self. You simply are. It feels natural, effortless, inevitable. You wake each day with a consciousness that is different, and the desires, fears, and reactions that once belonged to the old self no longer arise. You have no need to force new habits, for the old patterns have dissolved, and the new ones have been assumed with ease. The subconscious, once impressed by repetition and faith, sustains the new identity without struggle. You no longer play at imagining. You live in the reality you once imagined, and the line between inner vision and outer fact disappears entirely. This death of the old self is not to be mourned, for it was never the true essence of who you are. It was only a state of consciousness, a garment worn for a time, which you outgrew as you awakened to higher possibilities. Just as the child cannot return to the limitations of infancy, the transformed self cannot return to the narrow confines of the old identity. The shift is permanent, for once the mind has expanded into a new state, the former one becomes uninhabitable. You may remember fragments of the old self, but they seem unreal, as though you are recalling the story of another life. The transformation is so deep that you no longer even recognize the one you once called me. The beauty of transformation lies in its subtlety as well as its power. At first, it may feel like nothing is happening. You persist in imagining, in assuming, in dwelling in the wish fulfilled, and the world seems unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, the subconscious is at work, rewriting your story, dissolving the chains of past assumptions. Then one day, without effort, you notice that you are no longer triggered by what once bound you. You notice that opportunities flow where obstacles once stood. You notice that people respond to you differently, as though they too no longer recognize the old version of you. The shift becomes undeniable, not through sudden drama, but through the quiet realization that the old identity has vanished without resistance. Transformation is a resurrection. To die to the old self is to rise in the new. Each state of consciousness is a dimension of being, and you move from one to another by assuming it fully, by dwelling in its reality until it becomes your home. The world outside is compelled to reflect the state you occupy, for it has no life of its own apart from the life you lend it through belief. When you assume the new self and persist, the resurrection is inevitable. You awaken in a new world because you have awakened in a new self, and the old passes away without leaving a trace except in memory, a memory that itself begins to fade. When you stand in the fullness of transformation, you feel a sense of wonder at the distance you have traveled inwardly. The struggles, doubts, and limitations of the old self seem as though they belong to a stranger. The persistence that once felt difficult now reveals itself as the bridge to freedom. You recognize that transformation was never about adding something new to yourself, but about unveiling what was always possible, hidden beneath layers of assumption and belief. The old self was but a mask, and the new self is not a creation out of nothing, but the revelation of your truer nature, brought forth by faith and imagination. To reach this place, you must give yourself wholly to the vision of the new self. You must nurture it as a gardener nurtures the seed, refusing to uproot it with doubt, shielding it from the weeds of contradiction, watering it with focus, and trusting the process of unseen growth. Each act of faith, each moment of focus, each choice to dwell in the wish fulfilled, adds strength to the new identity until it stands unshakable. When this strength is reached, transformation is not partial or temporary, it is complete. The old self dissolves utterly, and the new self reigns without effort. Thus, transformation is recognized not by fleeting changes in behavior or circumstance, but by the profound realization that you are no longer who you once were. The shift is so thorough that even you cannot trace yourself back to the former state. The thoughts, feelings, and reactions of the old self are foreign, the old assumptions forgotten, the old limitations powerless. You have stepped fully into another dimension of selfhood, and in this dimension, the past does not bind you. Transformation is complete when you live so fully in the new state that the old self is unrecognizable, a ghost that has dissolved into the nothingness from which it came, leaving only the radiance of the one you have chosen to become.